Thank you very much for the discussion tonight. It was very frustrating because there was so much in it. It was very rich and many, many questions, and I'm only allowed one. I'm a CBDite. I live in New Manhattan, up behind the Queen Vic Market, and there's been a secret floodgate opened, not known to the community. There's 5 projects within a small grouping of that area of very large buildings of up to 60 stories. And inquiring about what was happening, I discovered that the community hasn't been involved in any discussions about this at all. And so my question to the panel is, do you feel the community, the residents, should be allowed to be involved and discuss these things? And is there anyone actually looking after the interests of residents in a city which is primarily a business entity and still is in Melbourne? One other quick comment. I also get very frustrated when vested interests decry community involvement and say, they're just Luddites and they don't want anything to change. And I think that's spin, as you would say.
Marcus Spiller, I'm going to put it to you. You're the urban planner. Yeah. What about this issue that again and again we see people in local residential areas saying, not in my backyard. I don't want greater density. I like my suburb the way it is.
Yeah. First of all, I'd like to make clear that I'm not a technocrat on these issues. I'm not one of those planners that Mark referred to, which is, who are saying, just give us the power and we can fix it. We need more democracy, not less democracy in the running of our cities. Now, when I say that, we are members of multiple communities. We're members of our local community and we deserve to have a say in matters that affect us locally. We're also members of a regional metropolitan community. And my point earlier was we have no forum to express ourselves in as far as those issues are concerned. And then we're members of the Victorian community and beyond, the national community. It's vital to have a sphere of governance that represents the metropolitan area so that we can mediate the tensions that inevitably arise between local interests and the interests of the metropolis. It is important to densify in certain locations. There will be points at which the local interest comes up against the interests of the metropolis in terms of its sustainability. At the moment, the way we mediate this is by having some hairy-chested minister step in and make decisions, and the politics are virtually lose-lose. I believe that if we did have a sphere of governance looking after the metropolitan area, we would be able to sort these problems more efficiently. I'm not saying they would go away, but they would be better mediated. And I would again draw down from the example of the Greater London Authority. Chuck made the remarks earlier, how come governments can't move faster on some of these very important environmental reforms that we know we need to make? Well, it would have been impossible for the Blair government, for example, to introduce road pricing in London. I know this is slightly off your point, but it's to do with governance. It would have been impossible for a central government to make that decision because it would have pitted the central government against the local community, and that would have been too hot to handle. But because you had a metropolitan government that could explain and deal with a metropolitan community, Ken Livingstone was able to introduce a very important environmental measure in terms of road pricing and a range of other incredibly important reforms around inclusionary zoning for affordable housing and a raft of environmental measures. So we have to get our government institutions right. We have to have a match between our government institutions and the spheres of community that we all live in. So it's not a technocratic solution, but a democratically driven solution that we should be looking for.
When you talk there about road pricing in London, you're of course talking about the congestion charges,
yes,
which were unpopular at the start, but which have proved very popular in their implementation and have been greatly successful in reducing traffic congestion in London. We've also seen public transport use in London go up by, I think, about 30% over a decade, yes, partly through the creation of a Greater London Transport Board. But we in fact do have a city in Australia that has the sort of administration you're talking about. It's called Brisbane. It has a greater metropolitan city council that controls the whole greater Brisbane area, and I don't think it's a model of planning rectitude and democratic outcomes necessarily.
With respect, Peter, it's not a metropolitan governance, it's an overgrown local government. SEQ, South East Queensland, is the metropolis. It stretches from the Gold Coast right up to Noosa and west to Toowoomba. That is the metropolis, that is the community of interest that needs to be managed better. Brisbane City Council is just, if you like, the capital of one city amongst several. So I wouldn't call it a regional government at all.
Okay, let's take another question.
You mentioned before that you didn't think transport could be efficient without density, and it was mentioned by a few others, but I think there's a lot of evidence that good public transport networks are possible without high density, and I don't want to speak Paul Mees' latest book, heaven forbid, but he makes the claim that, in fact, the best public transport systems are those that are well networked, not those that are in high density places. And Saul, I suppose there's a question for Saul, it's about pricing. Well, that's for the whole panel. Once we start suggesting that, in fact, we pay to live in good environments, if we're willing to pay for those environments, then, and we're willing to live in places where we've got contact with nature, if you can pay the price, other people can live in dense localities. Are we suggesting that some people are going to have contact with nature, some people are going to have the livability that the natural environment brings, and other people aren't going to be able to afford it? I mean, I'm afraid of that sort of city, where there'll be people who can afford to be in touch with nature, people who can afford to be highly mobile in efficient public transport networks, and people who are going to be in less affordable places with less of the livability that would bring.
So Leslake, I'll invite you to respond to that. Just on the Paul Mees book on public transport, I'll be speaking to Paul Mees on the national interest next Friday, so I'll stand to be corrected by Paul when I interview him about his book. So Leslake, on that question, if we put a price on everything, does it raise that risk that, in fact, yes, the rich will have a desirable lifestyle and they'll be able to have contact with nature, but there'll be a lot of people priced out of the livability in a city?
I think that's already true. You know, I think it's already the case that people who can choose to live in the most desirable locations do that through the housing market and the other choices they make. And I do worry about the extent to which movements in house prices are adversely affecting the range of choices that people other than the wealthiest are able to make. And hence, for a long time, for almost as long as I've been a professional economist, I've been arguing against policies that end up making housing more expensive by pumping up the demand for it, like first home owner grants and negative gearing and stamp duty concessions and all of those sorts of things. I think, and I reiterate what I said before, that the pricing mechanism, which can be influenced by taxation, so I'm not necessarily talking about free market pricing, but the prices that people are confronted with, influenced as they might be by governments, is a very effective way of affecting people's behaviour, for good or ill, depending on how government policies impact on that. Obviously, people's capacity to respond to a different set of prices is influenced by their income. And the amount of income people have is also affected by government policy as regards income tax, wealth taxes, social security payments and the like. And I think it's inevitable that if we're going to have mechanisms of influencing people's behaviour that rely on prices, we're also going to have more effective means of redistributing some of the revenue that is raised by those prices back to people at the lower end of the spectrum so that they are not overall put at a disadvantage in terms of the choices that they can make. An example of that, to some degree, was what happened when the GST was introduced. That obviously was considered as a desirable tax reform, not by the Labor Party in Australia, but certainly by left-leaning parties in other parts of the world. These have been considered desirable taxes. And those at the bottom end of the spectrum, particularly pensioners, were overcompensated for the impact that the GST had on their expenditure patterns. The unemployed weren't, grant you, but pensioners certainly were. And you can do that through other means. So I don't think the argument that prima facie it might make some people worse off is an argument against doing those things if you take a more holistic approach to the whole problem.
Mark O'Connor.
I think the issue of house prices is a huge sleeper. I think it's the focus for an enormous amount of anger. if you were to believe the Murdoch press, house prices going up is a wonderful thing. It's an indication of a strong economy, and in one sense it is, and it makes everyone richer. I think Peter Costello actually boasted at one point that he'd made every Australian more than $10,000 richer because house prices had gone up. Now, this is not the way ordinary people see it. House prices are an enormous impost, a huge tax that ruins many people's lives, destroys many marriages. It's turned us from a society where only one member of a family had to work to one in which, just to buy a house in a middle-class suburb, usually both partners have to work full-time and at a middle-class type of job. It's a huge, huge cost. And the propaganda is you get it back later. Your house is an investment, you're told, when you buy it. Later it'll be worth $1 million. But most people never get to sell that house. By the time they're in that position, either they're too old and they're warned not to move away from the big city, or they need to put their children in it because their children, surprise, surprise, can't buy a house. So I think Ross Garner was right when he said that high house prices are a classic means for moving money from the poor to the rich, and even from the lower middle class to the upper middle class. The ordinary person doesn't profit by rising house prices normally, but those who own additional houses or housing blocks that neither they nor their children need, they make huge profits. They get huge amounts of free money, which incidentally they often squander in ways that are enormously carbon foolish. It's a huge problem, and we're not addressing it, and it can become a major fault line in this society. Many a marriage breaks up, children are neglected because both parents are working full-time and overtime. It's an absolute calamity if even one of them loses their job. It puts people under enormous stress, and I think people are very angry about it. If you were to add those other stresses I've suggested of shortage of oil and shortage of food, I think we could actually see strange and very dangerous social ructions within Australia. But I just point out the present to the fact that it is impoverishing Australians, it's destroying their quality of life, and it puts an extra impost on everything you buy. You get your shoes re-heeled. Well, think how much the person who owns the shoe kiosk is paying to own that tiny piece of land, or rather to rent it. It's an issue that's not being addressed.
Chuck Berger.
Just very quickly, one of the consequences of escalating home prices is that the only practical option for many people is to live in a newly constructed development, typically on the outer urban fringes. A lot of that new housing stock is very poorly designed in terms of energy efficiency and water efficiency, and a lot of it is very poorly serviced by public transport, which means you're locked into owning usually 2 vehicles and to paying very high fuel costs. So there's a little bit of a devil's bargain in buying a house at the lower end of the market. On the one hand, it's the only thing you can afford. On the other hand, by buying it, you're committing yourself to operating costs in terms of your energy bills, your water bills, and your fuel bills that can be ruinous. So on the one hand, we absolutely need to dismantle some of those taxation features of the system right now, at the same time as we're investing in public transport to try and alleviate some of that pressure on those developments.
Can I just make one comment too, Peter? I mean, I think this is always interesting in terms of every generation has got to deal with it. But what Australia has done is put this huge social value, as well as economic, on owning your own home and having your quarter-acre block or some variant on that. In many cases, the blocks have got smaller and the houses have got bigger. And so we have this extraordinary investment in housing stock. You know, I think when we look again to the future and what we should be doing, it goes to some fundamental issues like that. What are some of those triggers and levers that our question is asking about? Who gets left out in that? But, you know, I think there's some conventional wisdom that really does need to be challenged in Melbourne, as in everywhere around this country, because we've got people aggregated in such a small part of the available land. I mean, how ridiculous is that?
There's a lot of revenue to be raised by government in taxing dramatic growths in value in the family home, but I'm not going to hold my breath to see a federal government propose doing that. A lot of votes to be lost indeed. I want to take a few contributions from the audience now because several people are waiting, and I'll get the panel then to respond collectively. So we'll take the first one up here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a solution
that will make Melbourne marvellous in 2050. And the solution is this. For goodness sake, connect the Bellarine and Mornington peninsulas. Make your traffic and infrastructure flow around two cities by the bay.
Next one, thank you.
2 points, house size and household size. The house size you've talked about, problem is at the moment that we have the largest house size, I think, of most cities in the world. That's generated by the focus groups that are conducted by the developers who ask people what they want, and people say we want bigger and bigger. I think that needs to be curbed. The other one's at the other end of the scale, which is household size. We have an ageing population. We also have an increase in the single-person households. Perhaps we can solve the problem by increasing the number of people occupying houses and at the same time decrease alienation as people get older as well and make more efficient use of what we've got.
Okay, thank you. Another contribution here.
Mary Drost from Planning Backlash, Coalition of Groups. I've got two quick comments I'd like to make, and then I've got a question. Okay, my question is to Mark O'Connor. All the political parties seem to be blinker-visioned about the population explosion, and they're frightened to come out and take a stand. What can we do? Who can we support?
Mark O'Connor.
Very quickly, yes, I wouldn't put too much faith in either of the main parties. I think there are people of goodwill. Obviously, Kelvin Thompson is not alone. There are many who slap him on the back and say privately they'd love to support what he says. And there are some people in the opposition too who are not happy at population growth. But I think they're too tied in with the big money, which they need to fight their campaigns. I think we probably do need a new party, and unfortunately it'll have to be more or less a single-issue party. The stable population party of Australia is trying to form at present. It needs 500 members to contest the next election. It has 300. If just 200 people from here went home tonight, Googled it and joined it, it could be up and running next week.
Okay, I'll invite other members of the panel to respond to the other contributions we've heard. We've heard about the issue of houses are getting bigger, households are getting smaller. We've heard the suggestion of really linking Melbourne across the bay between the Bellarine and Mornington peninsulas to double the use of our infrastructure, and we've heard the challenge put out as to whether any party is really interested in these issues. Marcus, do you want to start?
Well, I suppose the first thing I'd say is that 2050 is some time off yet, and we are talking, say, nominally 7 to 8 million. We are actually going to build, if you want to stay with the assumption, a second city in that time. There is no reason why that city has to be a reproduction of the gas-guzzling city that was built since 1945. That was my point earlier. And just to illustrate the point, if you contemplate a comparison between, say, Berlin and metropolitan Melbourne, and I chose Berlin because it has almost exactly the same population as Melbourne right now, Berlin occupies 1/10 of the land area of Melbourne. And people in Berlin, and I don't really regard Berliners as living in, although it's a city with a tragic history, it's a proud city and a city of a high standard of living. But people in Berlin consume 30% less power than we do. And 55% of Berliners get to work by public transport, by walking or by cycling, compared to our 25%. Now, there's absolutely no reason why we should shirk from the opportunity to actually build, I'm not saying a replica Berlin, but to take those urban design principles, those structural principles, in the new second city that we're going to build. But I also want to underline again that it's a mistake to think of metropolitan Melbourne as one amorphous blob. It is a collection of cities that needs to be networked. And in this sense, I do have some sympathy with the questioner from up top there, that it's important to network your city, it's important to have connectivity. This nourishes the economy, it gives us a competitive edge. If you think of the Northern European settlement pattern that Mary Dross referred to. It comprises a bunch of sustainable, walkable cities that are very well connected by, yes indeed, freeways and rapid rail systems. So networking our cities is a very important way to a sustainable Melbourne in 2050. We've already seen a little bit of it in the government's, I think, terrific initiative to link up the Ballarat, Bendigo and Geelong with fast train services. This has really stimulated growth in those areas. So every reason to be optimistic, I say.
Chuck Berger.
Two responses. First, on the housing issue. The Australian Bureau of Statistics put these figures together recently and worked out that there are something around 200,000 households in Australia that have one or two persons, but 4 or more bedrooms. So there's a lot of unused bedrooms out there. There's a lot of housing stock that's really too big, that's no longer fit for purpose. So we must be able to do something more creative there and more efficient. The other is on the question of the aging population and our ability to care for them, or for that matter, our ability to care for the environment. It really goes to a question of what are our fundamental priorities as a society. Somehow or other, we've managed to scrape together the resources to buy several million iPhones in the past couple of years. We've managed to scrape together just enough cash for a new fleet of attack submarines. And somewhere or other, we managed to find the cash for very expensive bottles of wine and lots of other things, some of which make life better, some of which make life a bit worse, I think. To suggest that we can't find the money or the resources to care for our aging folks, or we can't find the money to preserve the last remaining remnants of grasslands that are found nowhere else on the planet to the north and the west of Melbourne, I think is disingenuous. It's wrong. We can find the money, and to hear that we can't is really it's reprehensible. It's offensive to the people who care about those things and think that we should prioritize them.
Maureen Horder.
I'm just wanting to go back to that point that something like 40%, I think it is, of our population in total lives in Sydney and Melbourne. It's a vast continent. It's the largest island in the world. I can go on. We are underutilising this extraordinary capacity to have other nodes and other centres, and I think Marcus is absolutely right. I don't think I would condemn all governments to try and address that question. I don't think we've got it right, and I think when we trivialise and marginalise major issues like this kind of discussion and debate, by derailing something with there's 3,000 refugees coming from the north of Australia, that's not what, they're silly political debates for this country to have. We need to have serious discussions around these big issues. And that's where I think our parties are failing us. But then, we hear of some wonderful initiatives every now and then from the planning and community people here in Melbourne. I just like that idea that at least they do recognise that the two things go together. In Sydney, we in fact have a planning department, which I think the silent bit to that is and developers. So I'm being a little facetious, of course, but I'm trying to go to that point of how does the community get involved in this too? And I think we all, as citizens in a democracy, have the right and indeed the responsibility to be active in the debate. And if we haven't got community committees that are influencing government decision, then we should be taking action. So I just want to say, I think, there are opportunities. I think there are different options. I don't think the 8 million people have to be centred around Melbourne as we know it today. I think we do have to locate our growth around the state in an effective and a sensible way. And, I look at something, if I might, Peter, we've done so little in major infrastructure. I'm impressed with the fact that the Northern Territory government managed to get a railway down to Adelaide. After, it's one of the few things in the last 100 years of a major rail thing. Why don't we put some people out in the middle? There's a wonderful link up there. There's a hell of a lot of water there too right now.
And there's folks already living on that land.
Mark O'Connor.
My book and William Lyons' book, Overloading Australia, is pretty severe on people who run this line that it's a huge continent. It's a desert or semi-desert continent. Space really isn't the issue. It's not the issue even in China or India. They have large deserts in both those countries, and believe it or not, they're very sparsely populated for very obvious reasons. As to whether we could move our cities apart, yes, there are some obvious planning advantages, and whatever we do is the better for being well planned. But basically moving, putting another 2 million people in another city spaced a bit apart from the others, what do you achieve by that unless there's something they can do with the continent? And the great problem is that we are a nation that basically lives by selling off 1 billion years' worth of mineral resources in a few decades. There's a stunning figures in the intergenerational report that no one focuses on, where they list how long the various minerals we're living off are likely to last. For instance, they show that our oil, the most strategic of all our assets, will be gone well before 2020, just about the time that very likely world oil price will go through the roof. And that's the prediction of the US Defence Forces Joint Chiefs of Staff, as you may have seen last week. They're predicting within 5 years a shortfall of as much as 10 million barrels a day in world oil. So we're not even thinking strategically. We're living off the selling off of these assets. Basically, each person who's in Australia and each person who's welcomed in is being made the possessor, in effect, of a few $1 million worth of minerals. And it's amazingly difficult to find out an exact figure for that. No one seems interested, which they and their descendants are to sell off for the next few generations to survive by. And it will take enormous amounts of energy and CO2 emissions to get those minerals out of the ground and exported, which is one reason we have such a high footprint. It's a bizarre situation, isn't it?
So let's are we simply living off minerals and, a couple of generations just sort of spending away recklessly through Australia's mineral wealth? Is that all we do?
Not entirely, Peter. I mean, yes, it's true that minerals account for about 45% of our exports, but the mining sector accounts for 8% of GDP and provides 2.5% of the jobs. So it's not the biggest proportion of our economy. What I would say is that we have these minerals, God, the creator, or whoever put them there under our ground. The Chinese are willing to pay very high prices for them at this stage of their economic development, so why not sell it to them? Because if we don't, the Brazilians will sell theirs, or the South Africans will sell theirs, and we would just be foregoing it. I think we might as well take advantage of the particular constellation of forces that there are in the world at the moment that happen to work to our advantage. I'm not troubled by the fact that we're no longer self-sufficient in some of the things that we used to, any more than I'm personally self-sufficient in food, clothing and housing. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that Australia doesn't make its own colour televisions and lawnmowers in the way that we might have done, and T-shirts in the way that we might have done in the 1950s, nor do I see anything particularly wrong with the fact that most of our workforce are employed in providing services to other people, as long as people are willing to pay for it. It might be a problem that in total we import more than we export, but what components of our imports and exports are doesn't particularly trouble me a great deal, as long as the choices that people make in that regard aren't distorted by bad incentives. I think the bigger problem, and this sort of comes back to the points that Mark makes in his book, or that other advocates of much lower population growth have, is that it's all very well to say that Australia should cap its population at a particular figure, or the rate of growth of its population at a particular percentage per annum rate. But when you actually go down to the question of how do you achieve that, when we talk about reducing per capita consumption of carbon or something like that, then, we talk about putting the price up or imposing taxes and allowing people to respond to it. But if you want to cap the population, do you actually forbid people to have more than a certain number of children in the way the Chinese do? When you want to cap the level of migration, do you put the target up and say, OK, the first 10,000 a year are allowed in, everybody else you can go and stay on Christmas Island or Nauru for a while? I mean, that's where I start to get troubled, is the kind of decisions the authoritarian heavy hand of the state would be required to block people's choices, not only in coming here to Australia, but even moving within Australia, should the Victorian government, for example, have the power to say that no more than a certain number of New South Welsh persons or Queenslanders or Tasmanians can move to Melbourne per annum because the city is full, in the way that Bob Carr tried to say to the rest of the country 10 years ago?
Mark O'Connor to respond.
Let me see if I can reduce your anxieties slightly, Saul. I wasn't suggesting we don't sell these minerals, but that we sell them with a depletion protocol, which is that you sell them off more and more slowly, rather than, as at present, ever faster. We're actually doubling the rate at which various minerals are being sold every 15 years and sometimes less, which is why when we're told that we've got X decades for a given mineral at current rates of extraction, the reality is we're not keeping to current rates. We're ever accelerating. By contrast, with a depletion protocol, you can spin it out for a long time and probably make as much per year for many, many years. The other issue Saul raised is coercion. Fortunately, we're not in a position where we would have to use any particular coercion to stop our population growing. We should obviously stop paying baby bonuses, an absurd and stupid idea. It is obviously difficult not to subsidise babies and young people in various ways. You have to protect babies at risk, children at risk, families at risk, and sometimes those subsidies will be misinterpreted as a reward for having more babies. But what you don't do is actually go out and bribe parents to have more children, one for the country. That's absurd. Luckily, the Australian birth rate is a very respectable one. It's just a whisker below 2 children per couple, or more exactly per woman. And at that rate, you get even-sized generations. And while we currently have twice as many births as deaths in Australia every year, Costello was lying, of course, when he said that births were not keeping up with deaths. Births were twice deaths, and he knew it. But it won't go on like that forever. We will actually start to get even-sized generations and a stable population quite easily. According to different projections, natural increase without any kind of coercion will only add another 1 or possibly 2 million Australians. So if only we had balanced migration, a roughly even number of people coming in and going out, we could actually level off at 23 or 24 million.
So your proposal is zero net migration. So the number of people who migrate to Australia is equal by the number who choose to leave Australia each year.
That was the policy of the Australian Democrats, and it's a perfectly sensible policy. But I'm not sure I don't think we're going to get it soon. I think the reality is we're going to run a surplus of immigrants over immigrants. I don't welcome that, but I think it is the reality in the short term. The thing is to make it a small and reasonable surplus, and that's where Kelvin Thompson has suggested a middle course of something like 70,000 net migration, and still stabilising quite easily and naturally at something like 26 or 27 million. Now, I don't welcome adding that number of people to Australia. Just think what that would do to Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane, but it's a lot better than adding 36 million and climbing.
Please join me now in thanking our 5 panellists, Marcus Spiller, Maureen Horder, Charles Berger and Saul Eswaite and Mark O'Connor.